Good evening, everybody. If you'll take a seat, we'll get this show on the road. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is the third evening of a trio of nights in which we have begun to focus in on the actual designs that we've been sort of leading up to now for several months. And at the risk of boring you, I'm going to say once again that I'm Gail Ullman. I'm the chair of the sort of the home team that's been working on this, and I would also like to introduce those people to you as well. They can wave their hands, or if you don't know who they are, I would be surprised. From the council, we have the Mayor Liz Lempert, Jenny Krummeller, councilwoman, David Cohen, councilman. From the planning board, we have Louise Wilson, Julie Capozzoli, and myself. From SPRAB, we have Bill Wolf. Staff has been Derek Bridger, Jack West, and Eileen Cutronio, who are, I think, either on vacation or recovering from surgery, but not here. Our attorney has been Jerry, and will be, Jerry Muller. And we are very fortunate to have our new planner, Michael LaPlace, working with us. To give you a rundown on tonight's activity, we have taken a step beyond the last night's charrette, in which basically several concepts were discussed, a couple were discarded, and I frankly have no idea what the architects have done to the two that remained. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some new iterations altogether. We'll let them go through that entire program, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions or speak. The various background goals and objectives are posted around. I think you've seen them every time we've had a meeting, and we've had quite a few. I'd like to just say a sort of personal thing about this process, which has been a complete mystery to me from the beginning, and far more productive than I anticipated it. And if I had known at the beginning what I know now, I think I would have started with a slightly different point of view. I came to this thinking, well, there is this problem. The seminary has some changes it wants to make. The seminary is positioned in a very residential area, and the neighbors are likely to be extremely concerned about encroachments on their privacy, noise, and various other things. As we've gone through this, I've changed a little bit, and I realized that what we should have started off with was a stronger sense of vision, and in a way, I think that has come to us, and I can only say what it is for me because we've never articulated it amongst ourselves. But this is sort of what I would have wished I'd thought on day one, that what we're here to do is to encourage and enhance one of the significant historical institutions in the town, to help it gather its students together and move into the future, both on the assumption that buildings and reconstruction will have an effect throughout the whole campus as a kind of a movement. To protect and enhance the homes of the neighbors, to create a sustainable, this is an opportunity to create a sustainable building project. It would be great to be able to create clearer borders, perhaps between the seminary institution and the neighbors. And maybe most of all, it would be a great pleasure to help Princeton Theological Seminary create beautiful, appropriate, and efficient buildings for its students that will last for the next 150 years. So I think that's what we're up to tonight. You all have been just superb through this whole process. The notion of a problem has sort of evolved into the thought of a team with different points of view, but has a kind of similar approach. I wouldn't, having been on the planning board for a long time, that hasn't exactly been my experience. So this has been great, and we've been so fortunate to have LRK and Jim Constantine and Chris Cosenza sort of leading us through this process. So I'm going to turn this over to Jim now.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you all for coming. I think, is this anyone's first time here for one of the meetings on this? All right, so we have a repeat crowd. I'm going to step out here. I also want to note that while I'm out here starting this presentation, I'm going to be joined by the design team from Princeton Theological Seminary, Mark Hebden from Hugh & Cole, Rayford Law, and Meyer Baird. As well, Chris Paulson is here from Ewing Cole, and from our team, Chris Cosenza is off at another meeting up in Highland Park, and Juan Ayala teaching at Blaustein tonight. And we also, I think, had a lot of support from folks over the past couple of days as we've been moving through this process. So I'd like to specifically thank Bill Wolf, who was there joining us a lot, Councilman David Cohen, Mayor Liz Lempert, as well as Gail Ullman, the chair of the Ad-Hoc committee, for giving us lots of support. Michael Laplace, Derek Bridger. We needed a lot of cheering going on because there were a lot of changes and adjustments as we went through the community open house just 2 days ago. For some of us, it feels like it was 2 months ago. The progress design review last night, and you're going to see that we were on the fly making lots of adjustments today, and the public presentation where we are this evening. So there we were 2 nights ago. Actually in the afternoon, because we had a preview session, the special lane for the neighbors that came out. And I think some of you have heard this discussed previously. There were plans that were shown last year by the seminary, and then there was a stop on that as we went into this redevelopment process. Declared it an area in need, and we really were starting to some degree, not with a complete blank slate, but certainly with, I think, an openness to receive ideas and try to respond. And certainly one of those primary goals was to involve the community and the neighborhood. The council said this emphatically back in June when we started the process, to try to create outcomes better than existing zoning. So we took some of this information in, and came back with some concepts last night for the site, and everything's oriented the same. I think you all know the streets and the area, so we won't go through that. And we showed you an approach A. We showed you, we heard some things about this. One of the things that was sort of a sticking point was come in from Stockton. We showed an approach B, which had some great spaces and everything to it. So there were elements of this that we incorporated. Approach C, which was placing larger buildings closer to Stockton. We incorporated some of that. We looked at some of the recommendations from the Historic Preservation Commission and also had spent some time with them today really trying to work through those. We also had an approach J for neighbor Joel Schwartz, who dropped in at 3 o'clock yesterday. We felt what he did from 3 o'clock on, we gave him a chance to present last night, and there actually were some ideas that he presented and shared that we incorporated as well. So from all of that today, we had more than our work cut out for us to try to translate that, and it really was a team effort that you'll see the results of today. I think that's Rayford's hands at play there and others across the table to the plan that we have before you this evening. So we'd like to try to walk through this in pieces, and we do have it shown at a little greater scale so that you begin to see, because we've had refinements in everything from the gateway at Hibben and the roundabout and what's proposed on Edge Hill, as well as to what's actually arranged here in this location as well. I thought before we get into the plan, it was worth sort of noting this has been a collaborative process. This redevelopment process is different. It's the first time Princeton has used it. It's had incredible levels of neighborhood and community participation. Keep in mind, the normal way that you end up participating, usually as a community, as neighbors, is you get a notice and you're coming in and there's a fully baked plan and you're beginning to see presentations and having to respond sometimes as it's appearing before public bodies. In this case, some of the big things that happened as a result of the process, the recreation field on Mercer is being preserved. It's currently zoned for 4 single-family homes. And that was something the seminary offered right up front. We grabbed that property and pulled it into the redevelopment plan because we can use the redevelopment powers to give the municipality and to give that land preservation in perpetuity. The gym will be relocated. The gym was alive and active and spilling traffic going halfway down Hibben on a regular basis, or I should say parking. And as a result of this and some of the interaction with the ad hoc committee over the past 2 months, the seminary is settled in, and ultimately that gym will be relocated towards the nucleus of the campus rather than being at the edge and being sort of a generator of traffic not in the right location. And therefore, some of the overreaching efforts we were making to figure out how to park the gym can be relieved from the plan. We don't have to deal with that any longer. 3, the parking garage that was originally proposed last year on Hibben has been eliminated, and parking under the buildings, which was something that we still weren't clear of as of 2 days ago, has now been incorporated into the plan. Number 4, there will be no vehicular access to parking from Hibben. There may be service drives and things that are required for emergency access. However, number 5, we're emphasizing Stockton Street for the vehicular access, the orientation, and really for the address of this. Yes, parts of this spill down Hibben, parts of this interact with Edge Hill, but in terms of, I think, some of the impact, that address is on Stockton, which got us to number 6, really looking at how to position building forms, massing, some height. I think you can see a beautiful rendering that Rayford worked up today, massing in the spaces that Meyer was working on as well, for placemaking, a sense of arrival, that when you reach this point, you know you've reached the center of Princeton, you know you've reached the center of a college town, you know you've reached the seminary campus. and we hope it's in a way that's even better than what's there today. Creating a transition, and this is also dealing with Stockton, and we heard a lot about this last night. You know, we need to do more to try to take this higher speed road, this highway that's sort of in the environs or outside of town, and you sort of come up into town, and the next thing you know, you're at Library Place, you're in town. The transition isn't appropriate enough. So how can we provide interventions with the massing, the building, the form, that sense of arrival, combined with things like on-street parking along Stockton, to combine all of those things together to really create this sense of arriving at the center of town at a complete street. You are so close to the center of town today, but you're in this sort of quasi edge of town. Where am I? So we're really going to bring that out and show you how we've done that in the plan. Utilizing buffers and transitions in scale, some reduced massing, some lower height, some residential articulation closer to neighbors. And then last, providing enhanced access to parking for some of the neighbors on Edge Hill. We're at the fine grain. We're addressing some of the existing properties that interface with the back of this and that are most impacted. So back to the plan. The Seminary Library is here at Library Place. Some of the larger conditions we've talked about on Mercer Street, the preservation of the field, an enhanced gateway coming into Hibben. I think it was discovered that the original design for Hibben did have a forked entry. We've sort of calibrated that back in order to accommodate a full recreation field at that point. And there could be some sort of a defined identified gateway at that point that just sort of further chokes and pinches the traffic down as you come on to Hibben Street. We've reflected that at the other end. A roundabout at the intersection of Library Place. A lot of focus on how we can make Library Place perform at a higher order, really be the collector that it should be. We know people now avoid Library and shortcut down Edge Hill or up Hibben. And so we really want Library to function better. There's been discussions as well about signalization and possibly an additional turn lane at the other end. Part of the adjustments we've made on the roundabout, working with the Historic Preservation Commission, have been trying to maintain the sidewalk along Mercer in its most direct route possible so that you weren't having to sort of bypass the roundabout, and that involves sliding that roundabout into some of the Seminary property on the other side of Mercer Hill. We think it will help Library Place, it will help Mercer, Bayard, Nassau, Alexander further up the road, and that to some degree, if we can basically increase and sort of raise the performance of Library Place as the major corridor through this area, and it should help Lover's Lane as well. Ball field, fence would come down, some landscape improvements, and a paired, narrowed sort of one way in each direction around those existing trees. The other gateway approach coming up Stockton, it is 30 miles per hour. I think it's probably hard for most motorists to do 30 coming in through here because there is this sense of, you know, am I in the center of town or edge of town? There's noise issues the residents along there are trying to deal with, and here's the approach today up towards the gym. We talked a lot about the fact that the blank wall is really sort of a visual terminus. When you hit this first point, speeds are definitely higher than 30 miles per hour at this stretch through here, and what's proposed is to basically create a new landmark, arrival to Princeton, arrival to the seminary at this location. And Rayford, I'd like to have you maybe speak to this a little bit.
Thank you. I think responding to what Gail has kind of set up for us, and that is to say that there are a variety of forces that we are trying to acknowledge and to work with, engage, and create both with the neighbors for the seminary, and I think for Princeton at large. So part of the anticipation here is we are trying to create a residential campus for a community, for an institution that's been here for several hundred years. And as Gail has so aptly said, we would anticipate whatever we build here is suggesting another 100 or 150 years, if not longer. And like the educational institutions that exist in this town, and I must say, as someone who comes from a very large college town up the road, this is very important to acknowledge the role that these institutions play. Thereby, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge when the town has actually incorporated into its planning formulas the idea that we need to acknowledge the inhabitation and the institutional presence, that we can acknowledge that in the form of a gateway that really speaks to what we're doing here in Princeton. And we feel like the seminary has the potential here to, I'll say, replace the legacy of the original Hun school. I think we have tried, as we shared with you last night, we've tried very diligently to see how we might be able to reuse a building that was built in the 1920s for a middle school, prep school, that found it couldn't use it anymore 25 years later. So, and in that context, of course, we say, well, we recognize the legacy of the site, and at certain moments we'll be able to recognize the legacy of those pieces of building that do have, in fact, a documented historical value. But in the absence of the ability to make that work, we feel it's very important for us to acknowledge this gateway, the presence of the institution, and a friendly, but I'll say, if I may be so presumptuous, a timeless sort of image that would present the seminary and present the presence of education in general within the town of Princeton. We are employing, as you see, the traditional elements that we see on many higher education campuses, the gable ends, the pitched roof. This is residential. This is all residential. And the tradition of collegiate or collegial residential living is very important here, particularly in a residential area such as Mercer Hill. So employing those traditional forms, whether it's the gable end, even as I took from Scheme J, thanks to Joel, that the idea that we can actually create with an ensemble of pieces via an octagonal or apsidal form, something that starts to congeal in our collective memory about our passage into town, in conjunction, as Jim is saying, with those certain measures on street parking, the setbacks, the sense of the institutional presence that will start to slow down what is otherwise a somewhat empty street. That it really sort of enhances that sense that I'm not in town yet, so we can't go 30 miles an hour. So that's part of our mission here. Do you want to go to the next one? Okay. Is this? So to improve upon some aspects of the Scheme B that we were showing you last night, because we recognize as architects we probably become a bit inured to what we are modeling, and realize, of course, with your responses that the absence of trees, as well as knowing that when we had modeled it, we may have actually may have inflated or overinflated the massing of the building. So we wanted to make sure to come back today with a sense of some, I'll say, hybrid between Scheme A and Scheme B. I'm using the term. But really sort of defaulting to Scheme B, because when we look at that footprint, it actually has the least amount of building on the site. And as Joel mentioned to you last night, we feel like that creates more open space, much like what we have currently with Tennant Green. So there we go. So the idea, as I mentioned before, and I'll talk about it a little bit in diagrammatic terms later, the idea that the intent here to utilize this real estate is to provide a pedestrian campus. And part of that challenge of making a pedestrian campus has to do with helping you with the traffic issues that are currently here, And quite honestly, we all know these are traffic issues that are not related to the presence or the absence of the seminary. This is related to a more regional problem of how people come in and out of town. But that's part of what we're trying to help with as well, because we are talking about people living here as well, and we feel like that pedestrian environment would be very important. The idea, of course, is that to be efficient and to minimize the impact on the site, we'll be using generally a form of building that is a double-loaded corridor, but as you can see with the dormers and the double gables, we're trying to make it in the tradition, in fact, of what Tennant Hall was using. When one looks at the details of Tennant, all of the detail in that building is actually on the roof. It's how the building meets the sky. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. We've also tempered, in response to what we showed you last night, we have pulled back the building quite a bit. We're giving a bit more buffer here than what we might concede is the conventional 50-foot buffer between an R1 and an E4. Similarly, next to Brad and Nancy, right, that we would increase, we'd have the 50-foot buffer here, but actually pull the building back on the gym site. As I showed you in the perspective, sort of creating a more symbolic and conspicuously unusable space, right? I think that was our challenge before, was the large green lawn really wasn't able to be accommodated by anyone at the seminary as a communal space, as an active space. So we provide, as you saw in the perspective, we'll just go back, right? The idea that this is more symbolic and that the usable spaces are in fact behind, and we say usable, we're not fencing this off from the neighborhood, right? This is actually space that we will all enjoy, space that we can all use as we walk into town to be off the city streets, and that's part of the intent here. The view here from above the intersection at the end of Edge Hill, and so that you would see, there's, sorry, 30, sorry. There's 35 Edge Hill there. There's Silvana's, the Clark's house there with the path coming through. So a sensibility of putting most of the massing along Stockton. There is a bit up against the buffer, as you see here, but we are stepping it down as we get close to the house adjacent to the south. So that we have been working to tailor, to stitch, and while still holding on to the target unit count. Again, we will admit that there was some inflation when we were modeling yesterday, so as long as we are hitting our target and we can accommodate with this sort of kit of parts, that sort of varying ridgeline, varying heights of buildings with the motif, if you will, of an inhabited roof, because that does in fact signify residential life. Just to go back briefly, what we were speaking to was the ability to keep the students, but not exclusively the students, on campus. If we start from the existing condition here at the newly or renewed intersection at College and Alexander, but the idea in the master plan is that we would come into the core campus, the chapel, the student center, which down the road will need to be replaced. The premier building for the institution, Alexander, as it faces the library, and as we have noted today with some of you, the irony here is that most people don't even know that the seminary exists until they get to this point, which in fact is the middle of the campus, even though it's a county road. But to continue, because this, despite the sort of diminutive size in terms of area of land as well as the size of the community, it's very rare to see a campus this small that's so readily parsed up by city streets. But that is actually speaking to the legacy of both the neighborhood and the campus. This is one of the oldest parts of Princeton. The campus has been here for 200 years, and through a variety of instruments has grown into the neighborhood as the neighborhood has also developed. So the idea here is that we keep that path intact as a general strategic guideline for organizing open spaces along that path. As I spoke to you last night, even as an architect, what is very humbling is that it's in fact the landscape. It's the land between the buildings that actually defines the character of a campus. And in most cases, as you see in my perspectives, these buildings should be the scenographic backdrop that reinforces that more Arcadian nature and the serenity of a higher education institution. And thereby, this is what's important, is what we experience, what we like about walking through the seminary or the university campus is that that sense that I'm somewhere else. I'm something that's been redefined. It's a place that's designated for formation, for education, and I'm in a unique spot. And this is something that we all acknowledge in Princeton, right? When we walk through the university or walk through the seminary, whether it's with a particular destination in mind or we find that it's just pleasant enough that there's enough amenities for us to enjoy.
And I just wanted to add to the note that you mentioned, so we do have some model views that we're showing this evening. We had some last night. We believe that this fairly new, very good, smart projector was registering in autofocus, and it had actually distorted everything. So for those of you here last night, things looked shockingly large. And it took us a little bit this morning to kind of decipher and say, wait a second, this didn't look right to me. So the projector was autofocusing to a proportion that made everything look larger and taller. But yeah, we still looked at the massing and addressed it, but it made everything shockingly disproportionate. So let's talk about some of the components of this transition into town that we spoke about before. Rayford, spoke about we've actually brought a wonderful building with a little nod to our Scheme J, Joel, out here at this point, may look familiar, as part of this whole approach into town. So obviously, as we were looking at the corridor, understanding some of the issues, one of the things that came out was trying to provide an opportunity to bring the on-street parking, which right now begins further into the center of town, out as part of the whole ensemble of approaches to create this sense of arrival that really pulls itself down to the campus. Part of that was using a rear, suggesting the use of a rear lane, similar to what you find on Mercer Street. So those take place with that lane located here off of Library Place, which allows for the homes with driveways on Stockton to have driveways from behind, and then gain on-street parking on Stockton, which it begins right now over here to the left near Trinity Church. And to bring that down, and actually in response to some of what we heard last night, we think that parking should come the full length all the way down. Obviously, it could be a decision whether it goes further. It may not be warranted. Also, the removal of any parking from the existing gym site allows that on-street parking there and on that part of Hibben to provide convenient service for that portion. Again, a little choker or a neck down in the street on Hibben would delineate entering the residential portion of the street. So that parking would, again, we think, work in conjunction with the sight lines to the vista that we showed you, the little plazette at the corner, and extend itself down into town in a seamless manner. I should also just go back to and indicate one of the other opportunities with the on-street parking back on the plan is there is, for instance, this there's a passage through here, sightline from Campbellton through there. So, somebody could park here and walk over and through that passage to reach back into the buildings. Wonderful experiences that activate. And I think that's one of the other things that will work in addition. It's not just the on-street parking, which certainly makes walking and biking and would turn this section of, right now, this sort of highway that's pushing into town into a complete street, but it also allows for, or I should say the whole plan is really envisioning activation where you'll see people and movement, and I think seeing that foot traffic, increased bicycle traffic, students, the life of a college town will help with that sense of arrival. So that brings us to Edge Hill Street, where we've spent lots of time trying to focus on ways to bring the hidden garden out, ways that we can turn what right now is sort of a blank wall back of the institution interfacing with a wonderfully rich residential streetscape and bring those together, and an idea that's been evolving about how to treat that for some time. And I'm going to have Myra Baird come up right now and speak to this, since she's been working on this for the past couple of days.
Is the plan on the next slide?
Plan is on the next slide.
Okay. I'm going to start us with the plan here. So what we've been talking about is introducing a traffic slowing device along Edge Hill by introducing a change in paving from this point down to this point. And so this would all be a special paving slightly raised above the existing grade of the street. And then it would divert traffic. So this, at this point, when you're driving along Edge Hill, it would become, at this point, a one-way going down toward Mercer. And as you're coming back up from Mercer, you'd be coming around this arc. So it would be slightly diverting and narrowing within this area to slow traffic. It would allow for on-street parking in this area, and basically this whole vicinity would become a clearly designated safe pedestrian zone with slower traffic and site amenities. So some of this would begin, again, we've talked about the seminary's distinct desire to have a through, safe, accessible pedestrian route throughout campus. And so to connect the Tenant Roberts, the new development, into this, that's one of the reasons that we're beginning this paving change at this point, to designate that this is becoming a pedestrian zone, so that pedestrians at this point have safe passage over, across, and through the eventual new development of the Erdman building. Within this central area, we're looking to introduce kind of a, instead of getting rid of the fence that is there now, and inviting this zone to become a landscape zone and a landscape amenity both for the seminary community and for the neighbors. So within this area that is, this area that's between the two one-way loops of the road would introduce street trees and would have the pedestrian path come through at this point. And then beyond that, before we began this process, we had been talking in the master plan process with the seminary and talking to some of you this past summer about the seminary's commitment to maintaining this green zone, even with the new development of Erdman within the next 10, 15 years. So that can become a community space and also an amenity for the seminary. What we're showing in concept here is would have this green forecourt and then more of a garden-esque area with small areas for seating and gathering behind, again, enhancing the lovely planting that already exists throughout the campus. And I should go back to, I'll go back to our section here. So what we're seeing in section is up by Erdman would have this larger area. It's about 55 feet that would have seating area up closer to the building, and then coming out to a pedestrian walk and some perhaps understory flowering trees. This would be your narrowed one-way 12-foot traffic lane, and then this intermediate, what I call the kind of horticultural forecourt that would have trees, a pedestrian path, and turf. This would be your main route that goes straight down toward Mercer, some on-street parking, and then the existing houses. So we think this would, again, both the attempt is to combine address of traffic circulation with more of a knitting and enhancing of the community.
Thank you. Yeah, so that right there would basically be right where the fence is today. So we mentioned also an approach even at a very fine grain level. So in the access to parking, we've also tried to accommodate the Clark and Jacobus properties to provide for some parking, in fact, enhanced parking from what's there today, and access from the rear. So actually increase their capacity. So that's right in that location there. With that, as I mentioned before, access point for parking under the buildings coming from Stockton Street, between these two buildings here, using the existing driveway, a fairly straight T. I think we've had lots of discussions. Since it's a little safer to turn there than from Hibben, but the whole orientation address approach is that we're using the campus while it extends down Hibben and over and across Edge Hill to really help become part of that whole sequence of arriving in town, arriving in a college town, arriving in Princeton. So that brings us to a view here at down Hibben, looking up in this direction. Rayford.
Throughout the week, as well as hearing quite directly last night about the intent to put the bulk of the demand for the housing up along Stockton, and as you saw in my sketch, the idea that we use that bulk actually to signify that form of the gateway, as well as actually introducing the seminary boundary in a more, I'll say, traditional way, rather than discovering that you're in the seminary when you're in between its two largest buildings. So when we're going back to look at the massing, we heard immediately last night from Patrick that 50 feet might not be enough, but just to give you the sense in the sort of modeling technique that the technology shows us, that starting with the conventional prescriptions for the buffers that would separate the R1 from the E4, we would really plant heavy vegetative areas that are also doing stormwater management. There will be the need to manage all of the water that starts at the top of the hill. This is something that we have all inherited, right? That with increased development, with the start of the schools that were at the crest of the hill along that ridge line, is how we can actually manage the rainfall as it comes, how we actually keep it, store it, let it percolate through in a very substantive way. But as well to create a different kind of space that is going to complement the neighborhood as well, in addition to the buffer, and as you can see, starting to scale down both in the backside here in the corner, as well as the approach to the street, so that when we look from the street, we feel like what we're proposing here is an extension of that residential community. So we see the neighbors' houses to the right and to the left here as we're looking up Hibben, and how we are using the motif, much like Tennant, but also in a deliberate way that speaks specifically to the seminary character, the idea that we have a residential zone here that is respondent to the scale of the residential neighborhood that's adjacent. I have been a little selective in eliminating some of them so we could at least see some of the character with the photographs that we have been taking, of course. The London plane trees are there, and one of the positive aspects of the gym going away is we didn't have to do all the sort of, if I may use the term, the gymnastics to deal with the traffic. Right, so that was actually ostensibly being threatened by the idea that we create these sort of traffic calming devices. So it's our intent to keep those trees, those hardy London plane trees, when they are healthy. I think it's also important that what I'm not drawing here, as Silvana and I have talked about, is I deliberately have eliminated the vision of those overhead utility lines, right? So it's something, it's going to be on my radar here in Princeton for the next years, and that is, do we have to... Well, We did move it back 100 feet, right? So the surface that you see here of that building is actually 100 feet from the property line. This piece does come up to the 50-foot line, so a majority of those will stay, but they probably won't stay for the reasons you may want them, that they are not doing the work of stormwater management. That swale is not a substantial solution. We know there's still a water problem. Yes. You know, that's something we can look at, but they're not going to solve the storm. We can't solve the stormwater management without dealing with that landscape. That swale is not going to solve the problem that's there. It's, quite honestly, it's a Band-Aid for a problem that's much bigger than that. So we will plant trees. I mean, the trees will grow. So we will have to look and select and think about what we have to do to make it heavy vegetated. It's not our intent to clear cut and leave it. We really have to, we're going to, as I have shown you, right, we will have to plant quite heavily in order to substantially deal with the stormwater management. I guess we also want to touch on a little bit more specifically the character that we feel would be appropriate to be respondent both to the scale of the neighborhood as well as generate a distinct but not monolithic or even homogeneous character that's associated with the seminary. As I said before, the idea here is to be efficient. It's going to be a double-loaded corridor, which means a corridor down the center and the units to either side, which really presents us with a very broad footprint and a broad end. I developed this when we were looking at the planning for this, the idea that with offset gables, right, I can start to reduce the scale of this, create nice sort of dramatic bay windows, attic floors, because again, these are, as we note from tenant, these are the rooms that everyone loves, right, that when I inhabit the roof, I'm inhabiting rooms that have character. And so the idea is that I can also lower or raise these according to how we need to temper the scale, both as we approach Stockton with a 3 or 4 plus the roof, as opposed to going from 2 stories plus the roof as we head in more closer to the residential components, and then coloring them, of course, just for clarity to see how those twin gables can be scaled down, again, to look residential, right? It's institutional, it is the seminary, but to present a sort of collegial housing that's associated with people living there and learning there. A montage that we did before we met with the town officials last spring to speak to the types of things that we would do to enliven, to activate. The idea, as I used on the library, not that we would have to go that tall, but the idea that we don't have dark stairs, right? That stairs actually can provide those moments for dramatic interruptions of the horizontality of the floor plates of the housing. So, you know, the idea that you have bay windows, you actually have large corner windows, the types of things that we see in the houses in the neighborhood, and then with the gable ends as well, the idea that you can use the towers to sort of mark the institutional presence. I'm not sure that we would need to go that tall, but the idea would be that I can see people in and out of the stair and I connect to people in the buildings. In 3 dimensions, the twin gable and the 12-foot bay that we're generating to get the character that we're talking about. An early sketch that I developed in order to convey what we see as the appropriate character as you see modeled on the site. Starting with you know, the idea of a roofscape that's inhabited with dormers, the idea that it's a traditional roof with traditional material, if not traditional looking material, to reduce the amount of wall by making the floor at the eave line more transparent. So I have, in fact, an eave that's hovering instead of a parapet. And all that, again, is to reduce the amount of wall, to reduce the sort of impact of the building on the site. And all this was drawn before the redevelopment process, so we were trying to keep everything, as we still are, to a reasonable sort of height, floor to ceiling, floor to floor, that would keep that top of that dormer within the current code zoning compliance. Mark. To the ridge line, yes. But the town only measures to to the eave or to the dormer. Okay. Yes, Jim. Say again. I can't hear you. Well, as at least you instructed in November. Thank you. Because we were measuring, as we were instructed by you, we weren't measuring to the midpoint. We were actually measuring to the top of the dormer, right?
If we're going to take questions from the audience, we're not picking you up on the television, so.
We don't have the comparison, though. Here, do we have the comparison between tenant? I think tenant would be the referent, to answer your question. It's essentially on the front side of tenant. It's really it's actually above. So in a traditional building that is now inaccessible, my grade would be right about there, and I'd have 2 floors plus the attic. As the tenant drops down with the grade, that's essentially the condition I have on that back side, just for reference. Right?
Which ways? If we could ask you, let us try and get through the rest of the presentation. We have a few more minutes and we'll get to that point. Yesterday, when we met with you, we had been working through different options, different approaches, and so we were working to study and to test fit those options and also to get in preparation for them to be vetted, including your comments. And I hope you can see tonight that the synthesis of your comments have been incorporated into what we've been presenting tonight, and we want to thank you for all that input. It was important, though, in the process of doing that, we could not get into what is probably one of the most important parts of this coming to terms with how this all looks on the site, which is the architectural elements. So what you're seeing in the sketches today that Rayford has done, that we've done, are the architectural elements, which were really part of making the character of the buildings and also making them appear like they fit within the residential campus. Now, the other issue was we've talked about the technology. So we had the modeling technology yesterday, which is able to allow us to quickly compare those schemes, and you could see the scale of them relative to the different schemes in the buildings. But at the same time, it was difficult because it's so abstract without the architectural elements to give you that sense of scale. So, for example, in this section that we've drawn here, where you see that the eave line, that the entire dormer line at the center of the midpoint of the roof is about 43 feet, and you're going to have a space that's probably about 11 feet lower than that, which would be about 32 feet to the eave line, which is where the roof comes up. We wanted to give you some kind of context so you have some assurances that based on other buildings. So Rayford just spoke about tenant, but let's look at some of the other buildings on campus. And these are actual measured drawings. So we're looking at Stewart Hall from the late 1800s. And of course, being a classroom building, it had much bigger floor-to-floor heights, 16, 18, 17 feet. But when you get to the top of the highest eave point right here in the center of the building, you're already at 45 feet, which is only at the midpoint of the dormers, the midpoint of the roof of the buildings that we're proposing. And again, these are the buildings at that eave line that are out towards the Stockton Street side. The buildings that are back towards the residences and towards Hibben are going to have an eave line more in the range of 35 feet, with a midpoint of the roof only being about 40 feet, about 39 or 40 feet. Another example is the library. The library, again, has larger floor-to-floor heights because we have larger spaces to accommodate the stacks and the meeting rooms and even classroom spaces. There's also the atrium in the center of that building if you've been there. And again, we're looking at floor-to-floor heights that are in the range of 14 feet. Well, this is the elevation that faces Mercer. And the height of the top of the parapet of this building is 60 feet. And then this lower eave line, which faces Library Place, is about 42, 45 feet. So again, all of the buildings we're proposing are going to be lower than that. Not only the eave line's lower, but actually the peaks of the roofs are going to be lower than these buildings. Another comparison, again, these are measured drawings from construction drawings, and this is actually measured drawings from the project that's going on in terms of renovating Brown now. This building has floor-to-floor heights that are very similar to what we're going to have. They're going to be in the 10 to 11 foot range. So approximately 11-foot floor-to-floor heights. The eave of where the roof begins to spring up is again about 45 feet, and then the peak of the roof is about 59 feet or 60 feet, which figures in because in an E4 zone where these buildings are located, that's the zoning peak, that the highest point of the building has to be at about 60 feet. So by comparison, we want you to see that the buildings that we're proposing, again, the tallest buildings being along Stockton Street per what we heard from you last night, and then stepping down a whole story as we get to the buildings along Hibben and backing up to the residential neighborhoods. And one more example, this is just another measure drawing of Stewart. We went over Stewart before, so again, this is actually a drawing from the preservation work that's going on now in terms of preserving the stone and replacing the stone and the roof work that's going on currently on the main campus. Jim?
Thank you, Mark. Let's see where we are in the wrap-up. So that brings us towards the end. We're going to pass a mic around to take questions so we can pick you up. We are on live TV, and I think it'll be rebroadcast or available on the website. So there's the plan that basically emerged today. Yes, today. And I want to thank all of the residents and neighbors. I often describe this as sort of a consensus plan. It's difficult. We can't have a plan that achieves 100% of everything we hear from this person and that person and that person. So I've described if we can sort of get 70% of what we're hearing and feedback from the majority of the people, we have a plan that hopefully has achieved some level of consensus. But that's what we're here to hear. That's what we're here to hear feedback on today. Just in terms of where we are, we decided to create recommend creating a concept before actually going into a redevelopment plan. So the municipality is really concluding this process with this concept right now. Receive feedback, and then the ad hoc committee will make a recommendation of next steps. Until that time, that there's some next step. And the municipality under redevelopment is in full control. Doesn't mean that this plan is approved or adopted. As of today, the existing zoning is still in place, so that's important to recognize. And there is development potential as of right with the existing zoning. So some of the advantages we believe are available being in this redevelopment plan process is the ability, first and foremost, for greater control than conventional zoning, including the ability for absolute preservation of both structures and land. So things like the ball field down on Mercer, which is currently zoned R1 and can have 4 single-family lots as of right, could be preserved under the redevelopment plan in a absolute manner. Site-specific conceptual plan and design standards. So if the municipality goes forward with a redevelopment plan, they'll have a choice about the degree that you actually develop and lock down in that plan what will happen. That's different than zoning. Zoning, you create a formula, and then you wait to see what comes in that meets the formula. And right now, the master plan suggests and has lots of concerns and warnings that it lays out that the educational institutional zoning can result in things, especially when it's close to residential neighborhoods, that have incredible impacts that the formulas can't envision. So we have control to be able to custom craft this and continue to get feedback and input in terms of refinement. And then setting standards, the plan can be absolutely specific, so you know precisely what will happen, all of the improvements, time frames. Obviously, we can have public proactive participation. I'm not going to speak anymore. This, not only the past couple of days, the past 3 months have not been a demonstration of that, then I don't know what to say. It is a public-private partnering process, so the municipality will only have a redevelopment plan if we have a plan that the seminary can build, and so that's why it is an interactive one, but it's also interactive in involving the neighbors. And then we can protect community interests because we can designate the redeveloper, establish obligations, via a redevelopers agreement. So in addition, under normal zoning, somebody can have a piece of land and propose something. With redevelopment, the first thing is a municipality has to qualify them and designate them as the developer. And then you have the ability to negotiate contractually a whole series of things. So the much greater level of control would rest with the municipality than what's there today just with existing zoning. So with that, I think we're to the point of taking questions. Pardon me? Yeah, go back to the drawing. So we'll just maybe thank you.
Hi, thanks for all of your work. We really appreciate this. There are a couple of things I didn't understand in the presentation. One is, where will cars be allowed to park on Hibben?
So that's a detail to go into further. So what we've suggested is that Hibben may benefit in addition to sort of a pinch point here that defines entering the residential portion of the street, and perhaps the same at this end, that an alternate side parking condition may actually help to some degree, along possibly with chicanes that could be placed. It's also possible, by the way, to actually test some of these ideas. So the pinch points can be tested with cones, and they can be done for 2 hours or 2 days or 2 weeks. The same thing with chicanes, and whether it might require some resolution by council or not, alternate parking. So we would recommend that you actually test some of these things to see how traffic responds to it in advance of reaching a final design, and we would see that would occur in the next phase, and that's something that would involve the neighbors because they're going to be there and helping to monitor it.
And then the other is, you told us about relative heights of things, but what you've designed for the new tenant whatever it is, how will the heights of those buildings compare to what's there now?
Oh, you want to go back to the... we don't have the graphic. I'm sorry, we don't have the...
Go back to the section.
Oh, the question is how the heights of the new buildings will compare to the heights of the buildings that are there now?
So
No, on the Tenant Roberts.
took it out. We can't
Tenant Roberts campus.
right.
So I don't care how they compare to other buildings.
So the backside of Tenant would be this height, right? The 3 stories scrolling down, and the slope would come up to here. So it's a combination, because Tenant Hall actually is the place where the land creases and drops down. So it would be coming in where my hand is here, right? And the green line in front, and it starts sloping down.
So,
Sorry. Is this on? Right. Sorry. So the land, I'm just using the graphic because the morphology that we showed you last night, the tenant green comes in about this height relative to the floor level, right? And it's at the building, it starts sloping downhill. So this is about what you see on the backside of Tenant.
so let me ask the question in a slightly different way. If I'm standing on, say, Hibben, looking at the new building, will it be higher than if I'm standing on Hibben looking at the existing building, or will it be the same height, or
It
will
will
it
not
be
be a
lower?
consistent height. That's one thing we have done, is to make sure that we break down the scale. So there's no singular height as we were showing.
Okay, so tell me about the highest point that I see.
The ridge line is at about 50 feet high from the grade.
And what is it now?
Well, it's a gambrel roof. It's a hipped roof, so I'm going to say it's probably about 48, 49 feet. All right.
So that's the same as 50.
But we are trying deliberately, much like what Bowen did with those 3 buildings, is to modulate, right? There's no consistent roof height on any of those buildings in the ensemble that is Whitley, Tennant, and Roberts. Roberts, in fact, is 5 buildings. It's not 1, and they're all sort of segregated like townhouses. Tennant has the pavilions, right, sort of classic Georgian, where I've got a big building mass, which is the roof we were talking about when you asked me. Then I've got smaller pavilions, and then the gym does the same thing where it breaks down the scale as it actually reaches towards the perimeter. So we're trying to employ a similar technique that says to keep this from looking homogeneous, right? That we're going to start varying the roof height. So here's the comparison. This is the section of tenants. So you see the attic floor inhabited, the 2 floors here. What we don't see here, but in the model is this is dropping off, that basement, right? This is a 2-story version that shows a larger roof to get more yield in terms of area. And then do we have, can I advance it? Right, there we go. So, and we were talking about this last night, that we have a variety of pieces, right? That we want the sort of casual residential flavor of this, so that we have a series of pieces that speak to what would be the highest point here, but we can bring that down so that when we have 2 stories here, we bump that up and we get something like that. Or if we need to, when we're up along Stockton Street, we can in fact, get the bulk of the yield that we need along there. The possibility for a flat roof. We are trying to look at, even in this process, at sustainability, and typically the use of the roof for photovoltaic or something like that, whatever, green roofs, sort of denies the possibility of inhabiting the roof. So
Rayford, Shaneberg, Princeton Theological Seminary. If I'm understanding David's question, it's actually a really much more simple question than this. So if there is indeed a range of kind of peak roof heights on the site now, what's sort of that range? What's about the lowest to about the highest, and what's the range on what you've proposed? Folks are trying to get a sense of what the heights will be compared to what they are now.
We're always using the wall, so we're talking about the ridge height. Then I think the graphic will show you that this is about 48, 50 feet. This is probably 55 feet, and that's the highest point that we would have.
And then compare it to current tenant. Give us a...
Well, that's what I'm saying. This is about 48 feet, right, from here, right? These are probably 12 feet floor to floor, and that ridge. And you see what, in fact, is happening is I get 2 different pieces here. What we cut through is the low piece. So I'm going to say it's about 50 feet. Right?
So you're saying that the highest points there now are about the highest points in what you're proposing, and there's variations stepping down from that.
That's right. They're comparable.
Thank you.
Right.
Would there be changes to the terrain?
Well, we would.
I think we've still got to envision what it looks like, not just the mass and the height. What sort of stone would you be using? What buildings that we already know would it resemble?
Can we go back? Do we have the other PowerPoint? Can you just go back to the sketch? We see the tradition of masonry, right? And as the architect for the library, I have come to the realization that there has been a tradition of using local stone, with the exception of Mackay, which none of us can figure out, but using a local stone that is an ochre, an amber color, or the like. So what we would anticipate is a material that would be the color of the library. We think, though, it probably will be brick, right? I would love to use a Roman brick or a Norman brick, a long, slender brick in the tradition of masonry, so that I would get a visual texture here as well, right? And that will be, I think, and also in acknowledgement of the color of the 3 bow-end buildings, which are cream stucco. We choose not to use stucco. We don't think it really isn't the right material for this climate, right? It's a constant sort of maintenance condition. So I'm not drawing the texture here, but I do anticipate, right, that using a masonry unit like a Norman or Roman brick that will be similar richness of color like the library would be the material of the wall.
Okay.
And I would imagine that we would be looking at a slate or a slate-like material on the roof. I would not think we'd be going to asphalt shingles. I think this is really a building Gail said 150. When we as builders talk, we talk about 100-year buildings, right? And it's now we're out of the market conditions that dictate that we really need to use less expensive materials. So I think we'll be looking at a slate or slate-like material on the roof.
And when you are building these, you're building them with a complete story underground also.
The idea is the real estate is valuable, much like your house is. We feel like we should have that utility of the additional space, generally without light, below grade. That's right. And that can offer a variety of functions for the inhabitants and for the seminary at large. It would be bicycle storage or general storage. There will be some utility rooms, of course, that will be required to support the mechanical systems in the buildings.
And we are all defined, actually, Hibben and Edgehill, as people who are under the slope of these buildings.
Stormwater management is a little bit
This is extremely important for
exactly,
us.
and that's why we speak to how we're going to deal with the slope of the land using the best techniques that we know that are also occupiable. It doesn't do us any good to create stormwater management that no one can use. So it's part of what's built into the project is to create a system of managing outfall that doesn't exist currently and never existed on that site.
Thank you.
Well, I have the mic. I'm an Edge Hill Street resident. Of the various plans that were examined, the one that seemed most unorthodox to me was C, in which the Hibben and Edge Hill streets were closed off into a cul-de-sac, and presumably a road would pass through the campus, and whether your access is from Stockton in the middle on a no-through route or from Edge Hill or Hibben for the purpose of your own operation might be to be determined, but it had sort of an intuitive appeal to me. It's symmetrical with what goes on in the Battle Road neighborhood with respect to another estimable institution, and I just wondered why that plan was discarded, basically, of closing off the street completely. It solves through traffic problems permanently, and we have a geometric increase in traffic over the years coming through 206, the major country road access point. So for that neighborhood, in any case, it solves traffic problems from outside the community in perpetuity and creates a sense of closure and intimacy and serenity to the campus as well, which you're trying to achieve. So I just wondered what came of that.
Yeah. The closure of streets presents some policy issues and challenges to be addressed. So the first is if you probably threw it open across town, who wants portions of their street closed? You might have everybody wanting to, and so where does the traffic go? So in a well-functioning street hierarchy, a street network, you actually need a principle of connectivity for dispersion. I know it's tough because the streets here, Edge Hill and Hibben, face an inordinate amount of cut-through traffic, and we heard that. We've tried to address that. I think the difficulty is that every time you take a street out of the system, that traffic goes to another street. And so, if you start removing streets, then, and let's say you go and remove a quarter of them, well, there's going to be greater traffic burden on others if you remove half of them. The other policy issue raised is, and it's particularly important in Princeton, is one of street closures for campus expansion. So there are dozens of other situations where you could confront that. So that was a concern that was raised, relative to the functioning of the streets. And we also heard from other neighbors on the streets that did not like the idea of that kind of forced interconnection and no longer accessing Stockton. So. Gail? Oh, she's some in the back.
I'm Jane McLennan. I'm a neighbor of Sean Willentz, who was at the meeting last night but could not attend tonight. He's written a statement to the Ad-Hoc committee that he asked be read this evening. It's not... It's not quite as long as it looks. I did it in big print, so I didn't have to squint. So I would like to express to the ad hoc committee, there's a lot of feedback on this, is there? Okay. I would like to express to the ad hoc committee, the municipality, and the representatives of the Princeton Theological Seminary and the planners from DLR and LRK, as well as to my neighbors, my dismay and alarm at the information imparted at the presentation on Wednesday evening, March 13th, some of which may have been addressed, about the seminary's proposed redevelopment along Edge Hill and Hibben Road. For months, we have all been working in a spirit of mutual respect, understanding that compromises would be necessary, but trusting in a shared sense of obligation to the historic character of our streets and homes. For months, we residents have been repeatedly told in letters as well as in conversation that whatever the compromises might be, nothing would be left to compromise of all that makes the neighborhood such a singular treasure. Last night's presentations badly shook that trust. There were particular proposals that betrayed not just a lack of care, but an indifference to residents that bordered on arrogance. How else can one explain, for example, even suggesting planting one and possibly two entrances to the noisome underground garages on Hibben Road? How else can one explain a proposal to relocate 92 Stockton Street, a residence that is essential to the integrity and beauty of Edge Hill Street, and one we had been assured in the past would not be touched, and possibly have that space occupied by one of the newly built institutional dormitories? Even more trouble is the rationale behind so much of what is proposed. Mr. Law talked about the need to understand the educational function of the outdoors of a campus, about the need to plan with that in mind. Whatever that might mean, one thing needs to be made emphatically clear. Neither Edge Hill Street nor Hibben Road is on the seminary campus. The seminary owns properties along both streets, but those streets outside of those properties must not be treated or affected in any way as if they were elements or appendages of the seminary. Unfortunately, it began to look on Wednesday night as if the seminary and its planners do not sufficiently understand the distinction. I'll speak for the moment simply about Edge Hill Street. In his presentation, Mr. Law stated repeatedly that a crucial element of the overall plan is to create connections or pathways from the new dormitory complex to the library via the Erdman complex to the campus proper along across Mercer Street and then back again. His rendering of this came as ugly, dark red slashes, one of which cut right across Edge Hill Street. It appears that whatever else might be done, a major seminary pedestrian thoroughfare would run from the new dorms out onto and across Edge Hill Street. Thus, for much of the day, with peak times in the morning and late afternoon, there would be considerable foot traffic, not heavy necessarily, but considerable, not only on the seminary grounds, but on and across Edge Hill Street, with untold impact on the street's character. This pathway will then be accompanied by the suggested park-like improvements on and off seminary property, originally proposed to the Edge Hill residents as a combination of traffic calming measure and neighborhood beautification project. In fact, though, as part of the flow envisaged by Mr. Law, these are places where students will be congregating as they do not currently as part of their campus experience. As proposed, the changes on seminary property alone will have an effect on the ambience of the neighborhood, making it appear much more as part of a campus than anyone has ever conceived. Any changes made outside the seminary property will do so all the more. And combined with the pathway crossing the street or that section of it will virtually become a part of the campus. For a long time, Edge Hill Street has had seminary properties on it. The design has the effect of turning Edge Hill Street, or a sizable portion of it, into part of the seminary campus. The damaging impact of this aspect of the plan and of the thinking that goes behind it, at least as presented on Wednesday evening, seem incalculable. How is it different from sticking Edge Hill Street or a large part of it somewhere across Mercer Street into the very heart of the seminary's proper campus? It will certainly obliterate the street's character as a thing apart, its own very special place. In turning a section of Edge Hill, which is after all a very small street, into what appears to be part of an educational institution, it will, of course, degrade the market value of its residences. In all, I fear, instead of the street's residents sharing a neighborhood with the seminary, the street will be absorbed into what can only be described as seminary sprawl. There are many other factors that worsen this picture. The sheer massiveness of the proposed dormitories in their, sorry to say, dreary regularity, even with two different heights, will impede on Edge Hill Street as it will on Hibben in various visual ways, from their sheer presence in the sight lines to the blocking of sunlight and the dappled shadows that are also essential to the street's beauty. I have yet to see an indication that the plans have taken into account the noise and light pollution that will come from such a packed-in dormitory project, but the effects will be severe unless addressed firmly. It became clear to me, though, at Wednesday's meeting that at the most of many or even most of these problems is the presumption of making Edge Hill Street and possibly Hibben Road as well part of the seminary campus, a way station in the supposedly imperative red slash flow. I hope sincerely that everyone concerned will take heed of this, think through the ramifications, and shift our principles, our thinking, and our planning accordingly.
Thank you. I'm Joel Schwartz. I live on Armour Road. I have a few suggestions about where we are now and where we go in the process. One of the things that seems clear is that it's hard to understand exactly what the proposal is. And so one of the things I think needs to happen is that a lot more information needs to be shared. Some of it is physical design stuff, and some of it's numbers. So I'll give an example of numbers. There are three broad constituencies that are concerned about this project: the seminary, the town, and the neighbors. It's unclear as yet where the project lies in terms of the numbers, in this sense. There's a certain amount of stuff on the property, in terms of square footage, in terms of uses, in terms of cars, in terms of people, and no one really understands that there hasn't been a presentation about that. Second, there's amount of stuff which is permitted to be built under the existing zoning. And so if we didn't have this redevelopment process, the seminary would have no option but to pursue things under the existing zoning, which isn't really great for them and isn't really great for us, because it obliges the seminary to do things that aren't really useful and creates stuff that we're going to not like very much at all. But that's a legal reality, and so to frame the conversation, we really need to know more and to see clearly on paper what is allowed to be built under that zoning. The third is what the seminary would like to build. Because in order to evaluate the process, we need to compare all three sets of numbers. One, simply to understand what's going on. Two, since we're all citizens of Princeton, we want our town to get a good deal. In this redevelopment scenario, the great thing about it is that everyone can put their issues on the table and we can horse trade, so that we end up with something that works for everybody. But we don't have the information in terms of the numbers to understand that. We also don't have the information in terms of the massing of the building. And a great example of that, very simple questions were asked, like, what's the height of the building proposed and what's the height of the building that's existing? Well, it turns out that it's complicated because the ground slopes, and there's no single number that describes the height of Tennant and Roberts. And to the credit of the designers, they're trying to create buildings that also vary in height. But in order simply to understand physically what's there, we need diagrams and drawings and time to digest all of this stuff in order so that we can simply understand what's going on. Looking ahead down the road, in an ideal world, there would we'd go through more of this, the neighbors would understand more, the designers would understand more, the seminary and the town would understand more, and the process could move towards a consensus plan that everyone doesn't quite get exactly what they want, but it's a pretty good compromise. And if the process moved towards that, then I think that it would be all of us would feel better about it, and all of us would be more likely to support it if we understood the bases for that. That was the first of my 3 points. My second 2 are very short. One of the plans shows on-street parking along Stockton Street, and which I think is great because it creates more parking and it also slows the traffic down. I would like to suggest that the town, as an important partner in this, talk to the university and try to convince the university to give up a little sliver of land in front of the president's house so that the on-street parking that's being created is not just on the seminary property, but also on the president's property. It's a very small piece of land. The sidewalk's very wide. It's very easy to accomplish. And the reason I would like to see that happen is so that the street is a little more symmetrical, and with parking on both sides, it's going to have a greater effect of slowing traffic down. Second point. Now, the third point is really short. I made it a few days ago, and I'd like to reiterate it because there's a different group of people here. Though I live in the neighborhood, and though all of us would like to see, in some sense, the least amount of building here, I feel that this project, that whatever number of housing units are built, 20% of them should be affordable and count towards our affordable housing obligation. I will just leave it at that. There are lots of good reasons to be glad to talk to anyone about it, but the short take is that the best way for Princeton or any town to solve its affordable housing obligation is by building inclusionary housing where people of all types live together. And the seminary should do this, the university should do this, the institute should do this. Anywhere there's a project of this type that happen, 20% of the units should be affordable. Thanks.
Unfortunately, I wasn't around for the last couple of days when the redevelopment was really coming to fruition. And I guess living on Stockton and Library, my big concern is the great scale that it would be of the magnitude of the library, which was a big surprise as it was being built to me. I never knew it would be that mammoth. And my fear, especially with it being so close to Stockton Street, I really was hoping that they could back that up and having a big green area. And I think that this is going to transform the whole look on the gateway coming into Princeton. And I'm really not so thrilled about that. I was hoping it would be more subtle and that we would have some green, and I kind of like the historic preservation's presentation of there was one slide from them, and it looked like a beautiful garden in the front. And I guess it seems like another whole mammoth scheme, and it's going to take over that whole entrance to Princeton. I was kind of hoping it would be more subtle. The other thing, living on that highway, I think extending the parking is going to be very dangerous. The trucks, the semi-trucks come by there, and they are not slowing down. They are not slowing down. I think it's going to be very dangerous opening your door on that street as it gets further away from town. I really am against that idea for that reason. And I mean, is there any, I mean, what we really want is that we can fit in well with the existing neighborhood. And I think with the added height that we have in the structures that you're proposing, it seems like it's going to be more at the level of the library, and that it will completely take over the feel of the neighborhood. And I think that is evidenced by the height, and I think there was a lot of mystery about, you know, what is the actual height. And I would like to see those numbers, and I would like to see how they correspond with the other buildings that, and the structures that are currently there. But my main thing is I would really love those structures to be back further off of Stockton with a nice green in front of them.
And the trucks do come, and they come fast. And what I did hear last night, or not last night, the night before, somebody said if they had to do that, that they would possibly lower the speed limit, 5 miles or something. But it's dangerous because of the trucks especially. I mean, parking now just in front of the church is, it backs everything up forever. I just don't think, I agree, it's not a good idea.
My name's Heidi Fichtenbaum, and I'm the vice chair of the Princeton Environmental Commission. And actually, I really want to commend the town, the neighbors, and the planners and the designers who are working on this. Never an easy thing to do, but the fact that we've engaged in a town before everything is written into stone, honestly cannot tell you how lucky you are. I live 1 block from Avalon Bay, and that process was so incredibly different, right? We as neighbors basically had no say in that, in what happened. And so I just think that this is such a positive step in the right direction, and it really gives the town the opportunity to balance all the priorities. And obviously the seminary's priorities are going to be different than the neighbors' priorities, and the town has its priorities, but I am so encouraged just by the process, even if we haven't got to really that moment of perfecting this. And so I encourage you all to stay engaged in a positive manner, because this is sort of the best shot as far as I can see. And then just as a small comment, you know, I just want to reiterate, I had an opportunity to stop by this afternoon and talk to different people who are working on the project. And I really want to encourage the design team and the neighbors to think about, you know, a series of landscapes that can help to slow stormwater and to absorb stormwater. I was at a council meeting last Monday where they announced that, I don't know if everybody knows, but the typical amount of rain that we get every year in New Jersey is about 42 inches a year. We had 64 inches of rain in 2018. Wow. And you know, maybe it's an outlier, but I'm thinking actually we're kind of, with climate change, going in that direction. And so this series of gardens that actually have a environmental function, right? They provide an environmental service, I think is an important idea. And the other is that we think about solar access on our buildings moving forward. And what that means is that their roofs are oriented to be able to incorporate, say, photovoltaics, so that we can begin to generate more renewable energy, so that we can begin to address climate change and our greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you so much. I can't tell you, as a citizen of Princeton, as a member of the Environmental Commission, how much I appreciate the hard work going on.
Chris Folio, I'm a neighbor on Mercer Street. I did want to commend and echo Heidi's comments in terms of the process. In hearing a lot of the goals of the plan, we heard about the pedestrian crossings. So I just wanted to put out, I know it's not part of the designated area. I've been to a couple of these meetings, but it's hard not to look at the picture on the screen and not see that open parking lot. And for those of you who don't know my background, I'm an urban planner and a developer, so I kind of focus in on vacant land. Since one of the original plans did have a parking deck as part of the structure, I would just like to put out for consideration a parking structure on the existing parking lot that services the library, which would not then require underground parking, maybe even lowering the density on the new building sites and enhancing the pedestrian passageways that are part of the master plan. I'm reducing impervious coverage.
Just a question of density. I'm looking at the plan where Erdman is, and that looks like it covers the entire area where the land is now mainly open. And then also the buildings that are over by the tenant Roberts, seems like a lot of building in that area that it has now, it seems, a lot of green around it. And the question, other question I have is the seminary planning to move all of the CRW people into those Erdman buildings, or where are all the CRW building people going to live with the people that are still there now?
So can I say a couple things in response? It might go around the front, but that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for those questions, Bob. Good evening, everybody. Shane Berg, Executive Vice President at the Seminary, and most of you have been with us for a long time in this process, have given a lot of time to it. Thank you for being here again tonight. I think the way I want to come at your question, Bob, and also come at some of Sean's concerns. Thanks, Jane, for bringing that statement, and I'm sorry Sean couldn't be here, but I'm so glad that he keeps engaging and wrote that and you're willing to read it. Is to piggyback on what Joel said. So I can tell you how I understand where we are in the process. It won't address all the concerns that are bubbling up here, but I hope they'll address some of them. So as I understood what Jim Constantine was up to in putting us into a planning charrette was to try to come out of a season of listening to folks in the town, especially in the neighborhood, then to begin to try some concepts, get a bunch of designers and planners in the room. I mean, literally, they've been in the room next door for 2.5 days straight. I walked in there at the end of the day today, and it smells like if you go down in your basement after your teenage sons have had a sleepover. That's what the next morning, that's what it smells like in that room. So they've been drawing and testing, and they brought some stuff out last night just to see what the reaction would be. I think Sean may have misunderstood some of that. It was really some of the goal of that was to put things out to confirm that they wouldn't be viable. But they wanted some ideas to be seen for the sake of transparency. So it's been an intensive process, and they've got a concept here to be tested. And it seems to me that what happens next is you take a breath, and then we have to do precisely what Joel has said. So you begin to test this concept, and one of the ways you sort of test and assess this is you generate all the numbers associated with it. And those should all be comparatives. And so you should take a look at what that site is now and what Erdman is now, sort of facts and figures, number of people and units and cars and heights and square footages and all that stuff. Same thing here with the Tenant Roberts site. And then you look at what's possible under the zoning. And Jim Constantine keeps bringing us back to that. There's this 100,000+ square foot of buildable educational space here that can be pursued as of right. The kind of stuff that's allowed there is not the kind of stuff we would want to build there, but someone could buy it and build that stuff there. So what we're trying to do is, in the redevelopment process is to see if we can get to a solution on this site that fits what we need and works with the neighborhood. And so we've just generated this. So they just were hustling around and copying stuff off and scanning it, putting it up here. And now we need to sit with it and test it and let all of those kind of concerns and anxieties and objections sort of come up and to assess those and to see if this needs to be refined, improved, changed dramatically. I'm particularly grieved to hear the notion that the seminary is colonizing the neighborhood. So I understand why people would say that. That's not the way I want this to be perceived, and I don't want it to be the material reality. And so we spent a long time listening to you all and sort of talking about traffic calming. This sort of kind of this stuff here came up out of those conversations. And so that was, from my perspective, an attempt to really say what does the neighborhood need in terms of these streets and safety and beauty. And if the perception or the reality is that it seems like Edge Hill's been colonized, well, let's talk about that. Let's figure that out. Let's solve that. Because the whole point for me and the Princeton Seminary team is how do we be a good neighbor? The neighborhood is intertwined. And so how do we respect one another's proper roles in this neighborhood? So I think to Jim, you'll be the one who will sort of guide us forward, but I understand that the next step would be to assess, vet, and do the kind of analysis that Joel is suggesting. Do you want to say anything about that? So the kind of analysis you do would answer that question, Bob. So here's the kind of stuff that you want to know. So it isn't just a simple answer. Yeah. But I want to. Yeah. So. Yeah. So Bob, let me give you just a few numbers, and you tell me if they get at what you're thinking. So we've gone in the last 2 years, right, from a height of 550 students. We're on the way to 360. We're about 440 right now. So when the dust clears, we anticipate here and over on the main campus, housing, about 85% of our students are residential, so 85% of 360 students. And then some of those students have families. So they would be distributed between this site and the dorms up on the main campus. The concept here, while wanting some flexibility of the type of space in Erdman, I mean, its conception is still hotel conferencing, which the site does now. This is visiting scholars, people coming in for conferences, Rayford's 100 nights a year that he spends in Princeton. And so to go beyond the kind of monk-like cells that we have now and have something that's more appropriate if people are here for several weeks or something using the library. But it's not to distribute the students throughout all of those sites, here and there. And so then the question is to generate all the numbers associated with the number of people and so forth who would be here. But you have to take into account that the seminary student body is on the way down. But all the students and any partners and dependents who would be associated with the seminary would be here and then over on the main campus.
Yeah, hi. I live on Mike Head, live on Hibben Road. I'll keep this brief because we all want to go and have a glass of wine or something. I would say, Shane, nobody disputes the right of the seminary to redevelop the property which it currently owns. So we all understand that. The practical matter for the residents of the area is that was a school. It maybe wasn't being used as a school, but that was fundamentally a school designed for the 1930s. And therefore its scale and size, while it took up a large amount of land, was not inappropriate for the rest of the homes there. And we all got used to it. So I think
the work that's been done over the past few days, from what I've seen, has really moved this thing forward. I think compared with what it could have been, and I think there's a good attempt to make this look something distinctive, and I think everybody's done a good job. But the fact remains, and when you look at this map, you can see why people feel it's campusification of a residential neighborhood, because they are being enclosed by what are substantial buildings. And I think it's the scale of the project, and at the end of the day, we have always started with the fact that we want 120 apartments. And 120 apartments will give us something like this. And I think people have done a very good job to jam 120 apartments onto this site. There are going to be 200 people living on this site, or thereabouts. And I think the feeling is, it's just a bit too many, and it's a bit too big. And, you know, I think the debate, Joel raised the point, when we look at what the zoning would allow, and I think you and I have had conversations, if the zoning allows 100,000 square feet, and this happens to be 120,000 square feet, or whatever, there's a 20% overage, and you are doing it in a particular way, and I think congratulations to everybody. But I think if we could look at just bringing the scale of the whole thing down a little bit, it would just fit more with the environment. It doesn't solve your problem, and we understand that, but the scale is the thing that's overwhelming everything. And two last points, very minor. I think the buildings as illustrated look great. Yellow bricks don't do it for me. They make it look very institutional. And secondly, trees. We've got a garden with a lot of trees. They take a long time to grow. I think you're either going to put in substantial trees that are quasi-mature, which costs a lot of money but will look right, or we're going to have lots of little saplings that are going to struggle with all the other saplings, and it'll never quite look the way it looks. So that's it.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, you ask sharp and good questions as always, and the kind of deliberation that you're talking about is what I would understand now ensues if we follow the sort of thing that Joel is talking about.
I don't want to speak directly to the design, but I did want to respond to Sean's letter in a slightly different way than Shane did. Some of the things that were shown on the plans last night that were so objectionable to Sean, I think were best understood as a result of a design process which tries to think outside the box and come up with creative solutions by doing things that you wouldn't think made sense. That's what it means to think outside the box. I think if Sean were here tonight, he would see that virtually everything that he was upset about was abandoned because it was discovered that thinking outside of the box in those particular ways was not successful. But it doesn't invalidate the process of trying to think outside the box, generate a range of possibilities that are unexpected, and see what comes out of it. The only thing that hasn't been abandoned is the intervention on Edge Hill, which he went on at some length about. And I think that that's entirely negotiable. Basically, the intention is to knit the neighborhood and the institution together by creating a shared public space. Is it a change to the nature of Edge Hill? Yes, it is. Is it a bad change? Depends on your point of view. But I think that that was the intention, was to knit those two communities together around a shared open space, a shared usable open space. If that's not what the community wants, it's entirely negotiable. It's not critical from the point of view of the seminary. It was just a nice idea.
I'll just say that Sean's letter does not speak for everybody in Edgehill Street.
Yeah, at the meeting last night, the last note that you said, Jim, that you got from everybody was that most of the buildings should be up near Stockton, and that we should have a little buffer between Hibben and Edgehill and the neighborhood. And I mean, and I know this is the best out of all the ones you showed as far as I'm concerned, but I still have a building 50 feet from my house. I feel like there's so much space there that we are now on campus. And I just hope and I think it might be what Mike had said, it's just maybe the whole thing is just too big for the property, or if we could just move it a little bit where it feels more like it's the campus and not in our neighborhood. I'm still going to fight for those trees. I mean, everyone from the Ad-Hoc committee and everyone who came to visit the site always talked about Hibben being such a beautiful street. And the reason Hibben's such a beautiful street is because the old trees. I mean, you take the trees off the street and, I mean, it's still beautiful houses. So anything we can do to get those really mature, beautiful trees, which you're never going to replace. I mean, I'm not even saying, I'm guessing they do help with water, but even if they don't help with water, they just help for the beauty. I mean, that's what makes Princeton, Princeton. That's why I moved to Princeton. I mean, that people care about trees in it. That's what makes Princeton look like Princeton. And as far as a gateway into the city, is a gateway just, an apartment complex with new little trees? I mean, that's not the gateway to the city. It's got to look like Princeton. So, yeah, I'm all for it looking. I mean, when we bought the house, I liked that the seminary was my neighbor, because it was just such a beautiful old building that you only could get in Princeton. So I'm hoping at the end of the day, whatever it looks like, it still feels unique to our town.
So is scale and density a possibility? Is it negotiable that the project is going to look a little more diminished and fit in a little better? Or, I mean, how do we go from here? And also, I mean, I don't live on Hibben, I live on Stockton, so obviously I would love the buildings to be back a little further with some green, and for the whole gateway to not look so overwhelmed by this new community. It will definitely change the whole neighborhood feel, the way it's displayed here. So I'm just wondering, where do we go from here in terms of the scale? And are we going to have any green in the front to make it look a little more like a, more gardeny and not just all institutions along the road? Where do we go from here?
So where we go from here is this sort of concludes this phase of the developing a concept, which goes back in a week to the ad hoc committee to evaluate a next step. So I think they'll really deliberate on that on Friday, March 22nd, and really decide. It could be that they also want more information, in which case there will be a pause until more information is provided. They can make a recommendation to council to take some other action. So I think it's really the ad hoc committee to determine at that point. We use this process to try to create a concept that would allow for some evaluation and a decision on next steps or more information. So we use the process to get to this point. And I do think it's important to maybe just go back and address, because I think it was unfortunate that I've spent a lot of time with Sean Willentz, that he went away thinking that there was going to be a driveway off of Hibben, because we sort of did a group discussion and took that away last night. That was off the table, and the relocation of 92 Stockton, which was in one alternative is also not included in this. So so part of that, I think, as Councilman Cohen alluded to, was there were a number of ideas, things out there. There are elements in this that were not in the seminary's original program or on their wish list that have already been, I'll say, conceded. Eliminating the gym, not having access on Hibben, which makes a whole series of construction issues easier for them, and having the access to Stockton, which crosses this pedestrian route and things of that nature. So I think all of the comments are valid. We need to address some of what we've heard tonight, but I think it would be it's only fair to acknowledge that this has been moving a bit, and that we've been in real time trying to address concerns, and there have been concessions that are already part of the process, and we'll let the ad hoc committee go from there. So I'll turn it back to Gail Ullman.
Do you have time for one really brief question?
Just to the issue of Erdman, it's been kind of implicit all along that project was in the background, and I've heard words like a 10 or a 15-year horizon, and yet it does look extremely imposing on the map there. And I'm just wondering if that discussion needs to be taken into account during this deliberative process, so that 5 years from now, when this project is over, Erdman is slipped under the transom, so to speak. Particularly the height of that building and in that neighborhood, which is quite a bit different than the open space at the Stockton-Hibben junction, I think is partly what Sean was reacting to, because he lives, 50 feet from there, so, and I live across the street. So I don't know, but I'm just wondering where that fits into.
Do you want to address, I mean, yeah.
Good evening. I would like to know how definitive the Edge Hill Street road plan is, in terms of how, I'm sorry, I'm tired, it's late. Defined is that loop going to, I mean, is that definite, or is that where are we in that? 'Cause I'm personally not so keen on that loop. I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, this came out of addressing
Discussions,
earlier
right.
concerns and discussions on circulation. So what was discussed with a number of your other fellow residents on Monday evening was potentially raising the speed table. That allows for some of that pedestrian crossing to be more seamless, but also slows down traffic, I'll call it, through the core of Edge Hill, and loops a return. Part of it goes one way, part of it goes the other. So the speeding traffic up Edge Hill would have to slow down, turn slightly, proceed in a very narrow lane, no on-street, as tight as we can get it, return and come back up. We have to be a little wider at the ends because we have larger vehicles, trucks, fire trucks, moving vans that you have to accommodate. But the notion is that the entire section through here that's colored would be some sort of a texture paved surface and raised up to the curb level. So unlike this, what we call the speed tables that are more of humps on Hodge, and I think what happens is you tend to go to jump over it, rush to the next one. This would effectively raise the whole condition in there to create, I'll call it, more of a cobbled square.
So there's no parking,
There
road
would be
parking. Where's the road?
Parking would remain along your side of the street, but there also would be some places to bump out so that we achieve a narrowing of the street as well. So it's difficult. It's a series of sort of small interventions, but that would traffic going this way would have to slow down to raise up, then slightly swerve in. There'd be, return back here. There's on-street parking, and then come down and continue. So there's a lot of physical intervention this doesn't have to occur. Edge Hill Street could remain as is. That was something that the Historic Preservation Commission recommended.
The two questions are that one is, it just appears like more cement, more surface compared to what it is now. And I think it just the aesthetic of the neighborhood is significantly changed. And then also the brick wall that is there, is there now, is that going to be removed? Is that the project?
The stone wall in front of...
The brick wall that's as you enter Edge Hill on your right, that's currently there, is that going to be removed?
I don't know if that will be relocated, reconfigured is...
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I don't actually have a part, I guess, except to open these meetings, and now I'm going to close this one. Thank you very much, as always, for coming. It's not over. The Ad Hoc Committee is going to be meeting on Friday, next Friday, the 22nd. It will be strictly a working meeting. You're all invited, but we're not going to give you much chance to talk because we really have to settle some things here. I mean, this has been a wonderful process, and we're all still involved, but we're going to need to sit down, just our group, and make some tough decisions based on what we've heard, where we want to go. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming.